general, life is better than it ever has been, P.J. O'Rourke wrote in All the Trouble in the World. If you think that in the past there was some golden age of pleasure and plenty to which you would, if you were able, transport yourself, let me say one single word: dentistry. Stephen Davies' The Wealth Explosion, The Nature and Origins of Modernity explains why we have dentistry and people in the past did not. Some of those people in the past were sharp and competent too. 2nd century AD Rome, Song China, Abbasid Iraq. All three civilizations looked for a time like they would achieve what the Netherlands and the United Kingdom achieved in the 18th and 19th century. Industrialization followed by what Davies calls modernity. Why they didn't is part of this remarkable and compelling book, but why the UK in particular did forms much of the rest of it. Today's podcast is about The Wealth Explosion, The Nature and Origins of Modernity by Professor Stephen Davies from the University of Manchester, and he's also an adjunct scholar at the Institute for Economic Affairs, Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank, famously so called. Before I go much further, I should point out that O'Rourke's dentistry is of course a proxy for many things. Before Davies starts talking about Chinese dynasties and Scottish philosophers and enlightened caliphs, he makes two related points. First, the way we live now, roughly, the last 250 years, really is different from everything that went before. Secondly, that difference has particular characteristics. He sets out his case contrarily from Steven Pinker, who makes a similar argument at book length in The Better Angels of Our Nature. And this is mainly, I believe, because Davies is an historian, while Steven Pinker is a scientist, and they're going to approach the scholarship in this area in different ways. This means there are no graphs or diagrams in Davies' book, but an abundance of what Australians like to call ripping yarns. Given many people are unmoved by graphs, but are moved by narrative, by tall stories effectively, it's possible that The Wealth Explosion will persuade people where Better Angels did not. This podcast is a companion to a review of Davies' book that I wrote for CapX, which is a British online magazine that focuses pretty heavily on UK politics, and there's an awful lot of Brexit stuff on there, a lot of it very good, but they also try to cover ideas and values and beliefs, and they try to treat economics with a bit more respect than a lot of places do, who tend to get it wrong. And there's a link to the piece underneath the video. Materially, Davies makes it very clear, he sets this out really carefully. Modernity means there are more of us, largely because 4 in 10 children no longer die before puberty. That vast population lives uncommonly well, while the proportion of the world's people living in what the World Bank calls absolute poverty, the traditional figure is $1.25 a day, that's a US dollar, is dropping like a stone and has been for decades. Our economies are also overwhelmingly powered by intensive growth. This is an important concept in economics. Intensive growth is growth that arises from inputs being used more productively. So you're using the same amount of stuff, but you're using it better, more cleverly, more intelligently. You're making it go further. Before the 18th century, and there are some exceptions to this, but before the 18th century, nearly all economic growth was what economists call extensive growth. And that means the quantity of output produced was dependent on expansion, on using more inputs. In other words, to get more out, you had to put more stuff in. Now, reasonably, obviously, this is going to lead to resource constraints. And the most obvious consequence of this is it's one of the reasons why powerful states or empires in the past tried to conquer their neighbours, because it was a way of increasing the amount of inputs, because people hadn't wrapped their head around the idea of using those inputs more efficiently. So that's the difference between extensive growth and intensive growth. Nearly all growth now is intensive. Most of us now live in cities, something that emerged only as recently as 1851, when, and I quote Davies here, the census revealed that for the first time in human history, a majority of the British population lived in towns with a population of more than 50,000. Incredible as it may seem, too, in light of the ongoing Brexit shit show, and there's been lots on this podcast about that, governments in modern liberal democracies are actually astonishingly competent. The most able Roman prefect or Chinese mandarin, placed in a time machine and deposited in Whitehall, would be stunned at the lack of corruption, how we've succeeded in abolishing the sale of public offices, and also the just broader, genuine concern for what Davies calls, and I quote, the general welfare. A lot of people don't realise that governments, with relatively few exceptions going back thousands of years, were historically basically extractive super predators. That is, they existed to rip people off, to pick their pockets, and nothing more, to enrich a particular social class. Now, in those societies where you had governments that didn't want to be like that, they wanted to provide good governance for people, they wanted to do a proper job, and they had quite strong ideas about good government. Even in those societies, and the two big examples that Davies gives are pagan Rome and China for significant parts of its history, they nonetheless were not modern governments. They still had terrible problems with corruption, and they had something known as clientelism, or if you did classics, you will have heard of the patron-client relationship. Now, that doesn't mean appointing your nieces and nephews to government jobs all the time and that kind of thing as a standalone, but it can mean that. And in the better societies, basically people who were related to an individual got government jobs if they thought they would do them well. But in the societies that were more extractive, it was literally just jobs for the boys. So clientelism, helping your mates out instead of actually appointing people on the basis of merit. Very, very common in a lot of societies, and getting rid of it is actually very hard too, because you have to persuade people the overall wealth and health of the country is more important than the wealth and health of their family. And of course, you're biologically related to your family, and that's the basis of kin group selection, and it's a hugely important part of our evolutionary development over millennia, not just over the last few hundred years. We're also morally different from our ancestors. That becomes clear from Davies's book. And that includes even people who historically were very enlightened and high-minded. I mean, you read the Gospels and it's abundantly clear for all the nice things that Jesus Christ says, to pick the most famous of them. He thoroughly approved of slavery, because everybody did, except for a few educated people, and he wasn't a particularly well-educated person, he was an average person. People these days across the political spectrum are concerned about harms to unrelated strangers in distant lands, while across the developed world and large parts of the wealthier developing world, men and women are legal and political equals. These moral changes are simply extraordinary in light of human history, something Davies details with skill and elan, precisely because of his gift for storytelling. This means he's able to point out, for example, that societies where women weren't considered chattel and generally had significant rights, pagan Rome was a good example of that, but so was medieval Japan. That's why half of Japan's great literature was written by women. That's a sure sign that a society confers high status on women. You either find them in commerce and the law a lot, which was the Romans, or you find them in literature and the arts, which is very much the Japanese. And that's a sign that women are being treated with a degree of respect and being properly educated and also have full legal and contractual capacity. You can't do those things unless your society says that you have legal capacity to do them, or if you try to do them, you'll be silenced very rapidly, which is what happens in most other societies. Generally, the default group to be picked on in historic pre-modern civilizations is women, and some societies don't do that. But as Davies points out, the societies that don't do that, they find somebody else to pick on. And so, for example, among the Romans, approximately 20 to 25% of the population was slaves, and I would venture to guess that they were not treated particularly brilliantly. Insert all the vivid mental images you have here of, watching things like the HBO TV series Rome. That gives you a bit of an idea of what Romans tended to be like around their slaves. They were treated as though they were a bit expendable. And so because of this, because there's always a big group of people that gets crapped on in these pre-modern societies, you can paint a very vivid picture of arguments over those people and how they should be treated. And so Davies provides an account of the fights over individual autonomy and slavery between Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment figures in the 18th and 19th century. And you start to see things like the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which was put on a Wedgwood plate, for those of you who know a bit about the history of porcelain in the United Kingdom, and sold to raise money for anti-slavery, for abolitionist causes. To even be able to think about the idea of an unrelated person in a different country, at this point mainly in the West Indies and the United States, is someone you should view as a brother, is just unheard of intellectually. It's very, very rare, and it's very much a creation of Enlightenment thinking. And Davies sets out how it would have been intellectually impossible in any previous period of human history. Now, once Davies has cleared the moral undergrowth, he then discusses why historical civilisations that look like they were about to make like Manchester in the 19th century somehow didn't. Because his book is short, he's forced to provide more detail on one case study than others. This has two happy consequences. His chosen focus is Song Dynasty China, and that period lasted from 960 to 1279 AD, which has the effect of encouraging British readers to take a greater interest in Chinese history. And he also captures the extent to which China is a really different country and a really different civilization and lots of different traditions. And modern wealthy China now, it's the second biggest economy in the world, is producing a different kind of industrial modernity from that emerged in 18th century Europe. They're modernising and they're producing industrialisation, but it looks different. It's got different characteristics. Now, Song Dynasty China did things like abolishing internal passports. Yes, it seems ridiculous to have passports to go around in your own country, but lots of societies do this, and the Chinese did it a lot. They allowed a genuine free market in land, including the crucial ability to alienate. One of the reasons why Indigenous people in many countries, like in Australia and the US, often can't make any money out of all the land that they've acquired as a result of native title legislation of various sorts, or dependent nation state legislation in the US, is because they're not allowed to sell it. So that can cause quite serious problems. It means you can't use it as leverage. You can't turn it into money. The Song dynasty also ended the payment of taxes in kind, or what is known as corvée labour. That is basically you haven't got the cash to pay your taxes, so you go and dig ditches for the government. That's what it boils down to, basically. You have to go and rebuild the roads or the bridges because you can't afford to pay your taxes. It's a form of indentured labour, and it's really only a couple of rungs above slavery because it's compulsory. It's a form of civil conscription. The Song dynasty constructed navigable canals to facilitate internal trade and built a huge merchant navy. And as a result of these things, which sound very 19th century if you're familiar with the history of the Industrial Revolution, they started to enjoy modern-style intensive growth. The big giveaway is agricultural output doubled over the period of the Song dynasty, which is a really extraordinary achievement because this is a pre-green revolution, pre-GMO, pre-modern fertiliser society. That's a very, very impressive achievement by the Chinese to do that. And it's certainly fed into, in subsequent years, China's very large population relative to a lot of other countries. They got good at agriculture. They were very good at it. And rice is also a more sustaining grain crop than wheat or barley. So, why didn't the Song dynasty in China lead to the Industrial Revolution? Why was the Industrial Revolution ultimately British rather than Chinese? As is always the case when historians examine root causes, Davies provides lots of different explanations and he tries to weigh them up and work out which ones were most important. The Black Death was a major factor. It scythed down nearly 90% of China's population in some regions, long before it made its way along the Silk Road to wipe out half of Europe. It's very important to remember that the Black Death was obviously not in the Americas, but across the old world, the Black Death was huge. It didn't just happen in Europe, it happened everywhere as a dreadful plague. And because it hit in China first, there's a fair amount of research that shows when you get epidemics, when they initially strike, they're actually worse and they gradually peter out over time. So the version of the Black Death, of the plague, that hit China was actually worse than the version of the Black Death or plague that ultimately finished up in Europe in years like 1348 or 1665 in London. The next thing that comes after the Black Death was that they were then invaded by the Mongols. And the Mongols were a bit like the Black Death. They invaded everybody and they won. They were superb soldiers, but they weren't great at administration. And so basically anybody that the plague didn't kill, the Mongols did. And one of the other rival civilizations that could have perhaps produced an industrial revolution was Abbasid Iraq. It was the Abbasid Caliphate. And that was the period of Muslim history when they were very into science and technology and innovation and trying to come up with better ways of running the country. And their main city, which was full of all these wonderful libraries, was Baghdad. And the Mongols sacked it and they burnt all the libraries. And because this is before the printing press, if you burn all of a city's libraries down, it's quite likely that they're not going to be able to replace a lot of those books. And so a lot of Muslim knowledge was just lost. Crucially, the Mongol victory over Song China's largely Han population, most people in China are Han Chinese, it inflicted a form of psychic harm on the country. Long after China threw the Mongols out and reconquered vast amounts of territory, Song dynasty policies were associated in the Chinese national imagination with weakness and defeat. And this is still true. If you talk to people who've done sort of their country's history in a Chinese high school, they will have this very ambivalent relationship to the Song because they were beaten by the Mongols. Subsequent dynasties eventually set about reversing every single one of those Song dynasty policies, sometimes in extraordinarily stupid and destructive ways. So the peasants lost the right to sell their land, internal passports were reintroduced, and the merchant navy, and there was a special Chinese word for them, they were called treasure ships, they were big ocean-going junks. They were deliberately destroyed, as in literally the Ming government in the middle of the Ming dynasty went around banging holes in these ships just below the waterline and sinking them all. Now, that's how ridiculous the behaviour became. So then, come the 18th century, what made northwestern Europe, and especially the UK, different? Now, there's long been a trend in historical scholarship to try to argue that Europe was somehow exceptional, that it produced the Industrial Revolution because there was something special about it. Now, Davies accepts the something special about it, but not because of any cultural attribute in Europe. So the traditional arguments that used to be given for why there was European exceptionalism, there were things like European countries, first the Roman Empire and then the English, developed the first true example of the rule of law. Treat like cases alike, equality before the law, have proper rules of evidence, make sure your justice system isn't arbitrary. That's one of them. There's another scholar called Jared Diamond who thought it was because the Europeans had better animals that were easier to domesticate, and so they were better in farming, better in agriculture. So that was another argument. Other arguments is the status of women in Europe, particularly northwestern Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire was relatively high. Girls tended to get married later, which means that you had more of a nuclear family rather than everybody being in one household and dependent on a single male head of household. These are all arguments that have been made. And Davies goes through them all very carefully and just sort of knocks them all off one by one and says, no, that's not what's going on here. You just can't use that single thing as a precipitating cause for this. So what he focuses on instead is the extent to which Europe never became, and the phrase used is, a gunpowder empire, despite concerted attempts by the Habsburgs, the Habsburg period of the Holy Roman Empire, to try to make it a gunpowder empire. And the Habsburgs had a red-hot go at uniting the whole of Europe under a single crown. And the Spanish Armada was part of that, which was defeated in 1588. And yes, the navy, at that stage, it was the English navy, was a very good naval force, but the Spanish had a lot more ships and a lot more cannon, and yet the Spanish Armada was defeated, partly because the English ships were smaller and more manoeuvrable, but partly because there was a terrific storm and the Spaniards got the worst of it. So there was a lot of luck involved. Every other relatively developed region in the world at the same time became a gunpowder empire. So you had the emerging Russian Empire, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had China re-emerging under the Ming dynasty, and you also had a Safavid Iran, which was a great Shiite empire and sort of took over from the Abbasids as being the most cultured and developed among the Muslim countries. So Europe, and especially Western Europe, became a system of states. No regional hegemon emerged, which meant that the only way for the European powers to keep pace with competitors after the crucially important Peace of Westphalia in 1648, that was at the end of the 30 Years' War, which was a war of religion, was to innovate. Failure to innovate meant the country next door ate your national lunch. Even if a given ruler didn't particularly like capital markets or science, these were things that were being developed at the time, and they had a nasty habit of blowing holes in organised religion, which until that point European rulers used to try to unify their countries, and it wasn't very effective. That's what led to the 30 Years' War, because all that happened is you'd unite your own country, but it would be a different religion to the next door country. This meant that modernity took on a European and especially British cast. Because the UK already had strong institutions of governance independent of the Crown, Parliament and the courts, as you all know, and because it was first to break away from the peloton, most European states remained absolute monarchies for some time, liberal democracy and market capitalism came to be twinned in the minds of many observers. For decades, the claim that one implied the other was treated as a species of historical inevitability, and this was referred to at the time because it was very widespread, and it came to be known as Whig history, to always be very optimistic, and things were always going to get better, and we'd never fall back down the toilet into the past and forget some major scientific innovation. And of course it's silly and wrong, because it was as if the Roman Empire or the Song dynasty in China had never happened. And of course these are well-documented examples of societies that came afterwards being less developed and having having less technology and less good governments and a less good military than something that had gone before. So this Whig history is not accurate because it leaves lots of things out. So in short, while modernity is very special, and we've only had it for a short time, that 250 years I was talking about, it's pure historical contingency that it looks British. If the Spanish Armada had been victorious, if the Habsburgs had won, it would have been a completely different outcome and Britain would not have had pole position. Very much a historical accident. And going back in history, it seems pretty clear based on Davies' argument that modernity could have looked pagan Roman, or Abbasid, or Chinese, and it may still come to look Chinese, for the simple reason that China has been in pole position as a civilization for much of world history. This is very important, and Davies does a whole chapter on the extraordinary number of very impressive innovations that have come from China. And I admit, when it comes to looking at the Roman aspect of it, I was forced to confront this historical reality when I wrote my last novel, Kingdom of the Wicked, a work of speculative fiction. It takes place in a Roman Empire that's undergone an industrial revolution, and they had different values from us. If they'd have industrialised, the world would have looked really different. And one very striking difference between the Romans and us, and also between modern Chinese people and modern British people, is a much greater tolerance for authoritarianism as long as government remains competent. And I went to see Professor Davies at the Institute for Economic Affairs doing a presentation on this book, and at one point during that presentation, which was to an educated British audience, unfamiliar with Chinese history but knowledgeable about classical history, Davies just used the expression, he just described Chinese people as basically like the Romans. Which means this has consequences. If progress is to remain about more than dentistry and material comfort, those of us committed to liberty and individual autonomy need to make our case rather better than we have been doing up until recently, because there's actually nothing inevitable about human freedom.